So if a friend who'd never really thought about caterpillars as data asked you to explain what you actually do during the day, how would you explain it in one or two sentences?
Let's see. What I would say I do during the day is I take a wide range of plants and attempt to get caterpillars to eat them, and then measure how good they are at eating them or not eating them.
Yeah, so you really start out counting dung beetles and
Yeah.
and then you move to caterpillars in some of these New England
Yeah.
forests. So that's a really big jump
Yeah.
and continent and organism wise. So was there a moment when the question stayed the same though everything around it changed for your research?
So it's interesting how that transition was over a long period of time, where essentially I did this program out of the University of Florida studying dung beetles, and that actually got me really interested in landscape ecology, the study of how organisms of all types respond to fragmentation of the landscape, barriers to movement, size of the habitat that's available. And I was really interested in studying that, and I thought I wanted to study it in plants specifically. I like dung beetles, but I wanted to do plants. And then as I started to look into that in plants, I realized, oh, it's really cool that the landscape has all these effects on plants, and the plants have all these effects on insects. And so that's really what got me to caterpillars. It went from insects to landscapes to plants back to insects.
Yeah, so you spent 3 years surveying caterpillars across maybe 30 or so Connecticut forest fragments, which is 3 hectares to over 1,000. So what does that work actually look like day to day, and what surprised you the first time you did it?
So here's the thing about that work is actually I did a lot of the analysis of that work. I did a lot of the looking at that work, but I actually didn't collect that data. I only helped out a little bit
Interesting.
with that particular data collection. But what I can say is that I have gone out and done a lot of caterpillar collecting in just one of the 32 fragments, the Fenton tract outside of Yukon. I did a lot of that, and so how I would describe that is it's a lot like Christmas morning is how I put it, where you come up to a plant and it's just a complete surprise as to what is going to come out of that plant. You don't know. It's like coming down the stairs and seeing the presents under the tree. You take the plant, you sample the caterpillars out of it by striking it with a PVC pipe and seeing what caterpillars come out, and you just never know. And it's really exciting to see, oh, this cool caterpillar that we don't see very often, or yeah, of course, this caterpillar that we see everywhere is here. And every single plant is just like that. And you start to learn the different associations. Oh, I can expect to see this caterpillar on this plant. I can expect, since this nondescript green caterpillar came out of this plant, it's probably this one, not this one. Interesting things like that.
Yeah, so I interviewed Doug Tallamy as we were talking
Mhm.
earlier. So one of his big arguments is that native plants feed insects and introduced ones don't really feed insects, and that yards can be part of a solution. So your data says something a little adjacent, but also different, that the size of the habitat, that's not just what's planted inside it, also decides which insects live there. So where do those two pictures really agree, and where would you push back on some of his arguments?
Yeah, so it's really quite interesting. So this is a point in the research that I'd say is relatively new, mainly because people have not done a lot of work looking at invasive plants. I'm talking specifically about New England here, and seeing just what the caterpillar population on them looks like. And through some research that I've done, is I've found that in general, the caterpillars that are on there are about as many caterpillars on native plants as there are on invasive plants. But just saying that a caterpillar is there is such a small piece of the story. What I also found through that research was that yes, the caterpillars are there, but they're performing a lot worse. They take longer to go from being a caterpillar to a pupa. They're smaller when they pupate. They are less likely to actually make it to being a pupa. And on top of everything, they're more vulnerable to predators when they're eating an invasive plant. So it's this interesting space where if you look at it one way, there's no difference between the number of caterpillars that you may find on a native plant versus an invasive plant. But when you look at it another way, the caterpillars that are on the invasive plants are really doing quite poorly.
Yeah, so I was reading in one of your papers, specialists cluster
Mhm.
quite tightly where host plants are dense within 3 or so meters. Then they actually decline at between 20 and 50 meters. So the reverse of what resource concentration physics typically, or theory, typically predicts. And the generalist pattern only appeared once you weighted host availability by what those caterpillars actually prefer rather than what's simply present. And the second part also seemed like a really big finding to me. The effect was there really all along, and the standard method couldn't quite see it. So, how much of ecology do you think is hidden behind measuring the wrong thing? I know it's a bit of a
Yeah,
tricky
so
question.
it's an interesting broad question, which just to get right to the core of it, ecosystems are complex in ways that we are still just coming to grips with. You ask anyone, they'll say ecosystems are
Yeah.
complex. We know that. But exactly how complex they are and in what way they're complex is really taking a lot of figuring out right now. And so, what you're referring to, this electivity measure, was looking at these generalist caterpillars that are broadly assumed to eat pretty much all the plant species that we have here in New England, at least the woody ones for the subset that I'm working with, and finding that no, they do have stronger associations with some hosts than other ones. And the reason why this paper was new in this space is because this idea that you mentioned, the resource concentration hypothesis, was something that was only ever really theorized to apply to specialist caterpillars in an agricultural setting. And if you look at the vast majority of papers looking at it, it was wondering, okay, how densely should I plant my crops, my single crop? And should I intercrop with other species in a way as a way to reduce the amount of herbivory that my crops are going to experience? And all the research was focused on that. And so my paper was asking the question, one, can we expand this to natural ecosystems? And two, can we expand this to insect species that eat more than one plant? And doing that required a significant amount of theoretical thinking investment and statistical method investment to even begin to answer the question. And so I think that's really where a lot of it is hiding, is really taking these relatively simple theories and saying, with the right amount of thought put into the way that this is applied, can it be put into a natural context?
Yeah, so I was also reading that Japanese barberry showed up in your small fragments and witch hazel in the large ones. So barberry is considered an introduced shrub most people would call a weed. So what is a plant like that actually doing to the caterpillars in a small patch of woods?
It's basically taking that small patch of woods and making it not a habitat for that caterpillar anymore. So when I use the word habitat, I mean it in the really specific sense, which is that a habitat is a place where an animal can survive and ideally reproduce. And Japanese barberry can take what seems on the surface to be a habitat and convert it into a non-habitat, where before you had lots of different species of insects reproducing and surviving in these small habitats, these small forest fragments, no longer being able to reproduce there because the availability of the resources is simply no longer there because it's all Japanese barberry.
Yeah, so obviously you're at the Arnold Arboretum now, which is an institution whose entire purpose is really growing introduced trees from all over the world on land in the middle of a city. So does working here at the Arboretum really change what the words native and invasive mean to you in any context?
The ideas behind native and invasive are already on shaky ground to begin with. Take, for instance, the idea that, okay, a native plant is anything that's been in New England for at least 15,000 years. 15,000 years ago, there were exactly zero native plants to New England because this was 3 miles of ice. So, what exactly is a native plant starts to come into question then.
Mhm.
And then, in turn, that begins to question what is an invasive plant? Everything has come here within the last 15,000 years. So, what does it mean to be invasive? So, where I put it is into three categories. And this is just for the ease of my own work, and rational minds will disagree here. But I say that an invasive plant has to fit a few criteria. An invasive plant has to be brought here by humans, either purposefully or accidentally. It needs to be naturalized, which means that it is growing and reproducing its population in this environment. And finally, it needs to cause damage, either to human infrastructure or to native ecosystems. And once it meets all those criteria, then it can be considered invasive. So the vast majority of plants here at the Arboretum are what I consider to be non-invasive exotics, things that were brought here by people, but are not necessarily spreading or reproducing on their own, maybe in very small areas within the Arboretum, but are definitely not creating widespread damage. So when you look at it from that framework, the Arboretum transitions to something that is introducing a ton of harmful plants and instead is creating a essentially living collection, an herbarium, but the plants are alive, where researchers like me can come and do research that can't be done anywhere else in the world because this group of plants alive doesn't exist anywhere else in the world except for right here.
Yeah, so I asked almost every scientist this question, and it's a little bit, I know it's a specific, but on a scale from 1 to 5, 5 being the most urgent, how worried should the average person to be about insect decline and habitat fragmentation?
I think personally that insect decline is one of the most concerning ecological threats that is currently going on. Insects do not only an incredible amount of work for people. People talk about pollination. People talk the best pest control that exists is insects, and they control insects that we consider to be pests. But on top of that, they also just hold a lot of value for ecosystems, for songbirds, for the entire food chain is all put together. And so if the insects decline, that it can be pretty tightly linked to the just broad ecological decline of animals that we can see, which can be a real issue. So on the insect front, I will say that is one of our most pressing issues. Habitat fragmentation, on the other hand, is definitely something that is currently being debated as to whether it's as big of an issue as people think it is. There is some evidence that shows that fragmentation is a really, really big issue. For instance, the paper that you mentioned earlier about the trophic island biogeography theory, which basically is saying that as fragmentation increases, we're going to see fewer and fewer of these rare
Mhm.
species. They're going to go extinct at much higher rates than common species. On the other hand, you have ideas like the habitat amount hypothesis, which simply says what matters is the amount of habitat that's there, not how fragmented it is. So this is something that ecologists are definitely still debating and definitely still figuring out. But whether we'll come to any answers soon is to be
Yeah,
seen.
yeah, the number question is hard. I know this is a
Mhm.
little bit of a tricky one, but what's one specific thing that a regular person who's maybe not a scientist or an ecologist or anything in specific, just the average person could do or really notice this week that would actually help the insects near them?
I think that ultimately planting native plants is the most valuable thing that you can do. It simultaneously it reduces that both the fragmentation of habitats and increases the amount of habitat, so addressing both theories at the same time. It acts as somewhere that insects can perform every function that insects need in order to reproduce. They can feed on the leaves, they can pollinate the flowers, they can hunt for other insects there, they can use it as refuge, they can mate there. Just everything that insects need to do, they can do when there are more native plants and more
Mm,
diverse native plants. The other thing that I think that people can do that will really help out is just notice the insects that are there. If you're going around and you notice an insect on a plant, there's iNaturalist, you can snap it, and you can make
mm,
it part of this great community network that we have of citizen scientists. But on the other hand, just simply noticing that an insect is there just connects you more to the ecosystem that surrounds you. No matter where you go, no matter how urban you are still part of an ecosystem. And just understanding that you are part of an ecosystem will connect you to it more broadly and make you think more deeply about it
mm.
just as you're going through every activity throughout your day.
Yeah, so who are a few scientists or thinkers who you think I should interview after you. They don't have to be directly in the arboretum, as I'm not going to be here for that much
Hmm.
longer, but anyone who you think would be really fascinating and a good perspective for
Yeah,
me
well,
to interview.
the caterpillar guy to interview is absolutely Sam Jaffe out of the Caterpillar Lab.
Okay.
If you want to learn about native caterpillars of New England, there's no better guy to go to than Sam Jaffe. But otherwise, I don't know. It depends. It depends on what you're interested in learning.
I think for me, I'm trying to assemble as many different perspectives as possible. So that's why I look for very as caterpillars. That's not something that the everyday person would really think about. I'm trying to find a lot of these different perspectives and then create kind of an overarching perspective of here are some of the real world and current environmental science issues that are maybe a little bit not super dense and in a paper.
Yeah.
So I don't know if there's anyone
Yeah,
else.
so the person at the
Mhm,
at the forefront of both native
mhm,
caterpillars to New England, but also insect decline broadly is Dave Wagner out of the University of Connecticut. He Death by a Thousand Cuts. His paper on what exactly is causing insect declines has been cited thousands of times for only being half a decade old. The person who's really on the forefront of fighting the habitat fragmentation versus habitat
mhm.
amount debate is Lenore Ferrig. I can't claim to know her personally, but I've read a lot of her work,
Okay.
and she is really talking a lot about habitat and how much it matters, specifically to just all sorts of organisms.
Yeah, I'll definitely follow up. I'll send you an email, maybe a day, maybe 2 days afterwards. So I really, this last question, I ask every scientist this, and if every teenager on Earth had to hear one final sentence from you, what would it be?
Go notice insects.
All
That's
right.
it.